Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the seminar. I'm going to be introducing today's speaker on behalf of Kiberi, who was actually her supervisor for her master's thesis, but is on clinical service. She's going to try to join. I'll just apologize in advance. There's a bunch of construction happening outside my apartment, and so there may be loud noises, so I'll try to be brief. Nancy Wu is a recently minted Master's of Epidemiology from McGill in 2020, and she started her medical degree at the University of Toronto since then. And so I believe you're joining us from Toronto, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. But she is going to present work that she did with Kiberi and several others as part of her thesis. So without further ado, take it away, Nancy.
Sure. This feels, I was just telling Ben and Susan, this feels a little odd because I've been doing Zoom school basically for the past year. So I've been sort of on the viewer side of things, hearing the speaker say, oh, like, can you guys hear me properly? Can you see my slides? But now it feels like it's come full circle because I'm the one who's on this side of things. And not only that, but I am having, Dr. Smith kind of introduce me when, maybe just like 1.5 years ago, I was the one sitting down, kind of like listening to him speak and hearing his work. So it's really nice for me to be here. So thank you. I just kind of want to gauge who I'm speaking to here. I guess since I did do my Master of Science in Epidemiology at McGill, are there any other trainees here right now? And if so, maybe you can just like give like a thumbs up if you know how, or just like put it into the chat. But yeah, I would just love to know if there are any other trainees here. Okay. Oh yeah.
I see a few trainees and many applied researchers and pure epidemiologists and statisticians. So the full range.
Okay, great. It's really nice to have you all here. So I guess without further ado, I'll start. So as Dr. Smith mentioned, I'm a first-year medical student at the University of Toronto, and I did my Master of Science in Epidemiology at McGill with Dr. Dasgupta. And this presentation is basically one of the projects that I did that comprised my thesis. And so I'll be speaking about that today. I don't know if it's customary for students to say, I don't have any disclosures, but just to put it out there, I don't have any disclosures. But the work was supported by Dr. Dasgupta as well as the Research Institute. So with that, I will begin. So my project here was about core outcome sets. And I just want to kind of define things for people who might not be familiar with it. So core outcome set is a standardized set of outcomes to be reported across all trials in a specific area of research. And so the aim of this is to have different studies measuring in one field, measuring the same outcomes so that you can compare the trials with one another. So I have a friend who says that she's working on a meta-analysis right now, but one of the things that she's found really difficult is that these people are measuring different outcomes across the different studies. So it's been hard for her to kind of understand how to compare these things. So there is a whole initiative that's sort of set out to collect these core outcome sets, and it's called the Common Initiative. And so much like for randomized controlled trials, you can register your core outcome set here. You can search up a core outcome set if you're looking to start a certain trial. And there's also initiatives that are dedicated to specific fields as well. So there's the Crown Initiative, which is for core outcome sets in women's and newborn health. And so that's sort of relevant to the project that I worked on because we were looking at gestational diabetes. So to give a little bit of background, women who have gestational diabetes, and that's defined as a diagnosis of insulin resistance during pregnancy, are at a known higher risk of developing actual diabetes, so like type 2, later on in their life. And so it's of interest of us to be able to try to prevent that from happening if we know that they're high risk. And there was the American Diabetes Prevention Program, which showed that through health behavior change alone, they could reduce the incidence of diabetes in women who had a gestational diabetes pregnancy by 50%. So this was pretty cool. And so researchers decided that they wanted to try to study different ways that they could sort of intervene using health behavior change. So things like physical activity and diet changes and whatnot. the issue is that this American Diabetes Prevention Program enrolled women who were an average of 10 years past their pregnancy, but the highest incidence of diabetes after pregnancy occurs within 5 years. And in terms of like randomized controlled trials, most only follow women up to around like 26 weeks. So we're kind of stuck in this weird spot where, people are conducting these studies that are sort of shorter term, but because we're less able to capture that diagnosis of diabetes, which occurs like much later, we've resorted to kind of looking at other outcomes, right? So we're trying to guess here, okay, so instead of diabetes, what can we measure that's an indication that this trial worked, that it reduced their risk of developing diabetes? And so this variability is what has made systematic comparison of these trials difficult. And so what we set out to do was to develop that core outcome set for randomized controlled trials that are aiming to prevent the development of diabetes after a GDM pregnancy. And these trials are using behavior change interventions. So this is sort of an overview of the methodology. I think what you have to take away from this is that essentially we go from, listing all the outcomes that researchers are using to trying to narrow it down to this specific set that we think are most essential to be reporting in these trials. And so I'll take you through sort of what my supervisor and her colleagues did before I jumped onto this project. And so what they were responsible for doing was really just enumerating everything that people were already measuring. And so the first step was to do systematic review of those interventions. And so through the systematic review, they identified 38 studies, 80% of which were occurring between 2012 and 2017, comprising over 12,000 participants, and they came up with a whopping 172 outcomes. So that's kind of a lot. But then the next stage of this was to kind of reduce any redundancies across those 172 outcomes. So in terms of semantics, maybe 2 outcomes were defined the same way, but just the name was a little bit different. And so that's kind of what it means to reduce those redundancies. And those 121 outcomes were then grouped into 17 categories or domains. And so at this point, none of the investigators had imparted any value judgments on what was most important yet. So this was just simply an exercise of enumerating all of the outcomes. And to give you a sense of what outcomes were pulled out, it was really a range. So everything from physical characteristics of body weight, measures of diabetes risk like hemoglobin A1C, which is basically an average of your blood sugars, cardiometabolic risk factors, so all those sort of physical or medical things, but then also including factors such as dietary measures, measures of your physical activity, sleep, even measures related to behavior change, so psychological factors such as motivation to change behaviors. And then also they pulled out some program delivery measures, because when you think about it, these trials aren't being done just for the sake of conducting trials. We ideally want to be able to see what the program is like and to see whether or not it has real potential to be effective as a program, not just a trial. Okay, so moving on. So this is the stage where I joined in, which was the stage of the EDLT survey. So I just mentioned that prior to this, the job of the investigators so far was just to enumerate all of the outcomes. But this is the stage when we wanted to get people to sort of give their opinion on what they thought was most important. And so the EDLT survey is a really great way to get people, a heterogeneous population, to impart their opinion on something, but in a way that kind of takes away the group dynamics that might prevent people from coming to a proper consensus. So what do I mean by that? An example is, let's say you're in a meeting, in a real life, like person-to-person meeting, which, when was the last time we did that? I can't remember. But, even through Zoom, right? You might have an individual who's a little more outspoken. You might have isn't able to voice their opinion as much about what they think is important. And so, whether or not the consensus that they come to is actually representative of what people think is a little questionable. So, why don't I actually show you what our survey looked like so you can see how it kind of facilitated that process a little more smoothly. But I guess, yeah, first I should let you know who we got to take the survey, who we wanted to get the opinions of. And that would be physicians, researchers, and patients, so women who had had GDM. And so we looked at specifically sending out emails and invitations to diabetes-related listservs, websites related to diabetes and motherhood in general. We also, to recruit patients specifically, went back to existing or previous GDM studies to see if those patients wanted to take our survey as well. And yeah, let me just go straight to this survey so you can see what it looks like. So this was our homepage. And so this is an example of what round one of a survey would look like. So the outcomes would be here on the left. This is just sort of a screenshot taken from the software that we use. So the outcomes that are listed here aren't the ones that we use, but I just wanted to give you a general idea of what it looked like. So the outcomes would be here on the left. And then me as an individual, I would go in and I would be able to rank each outcome based on how important I thought it was, from 1, so not important at all the way to 9, which would be like, I think that this is really, really important. There's also the option here to say unable to score. So maybe I don't feel like I understand an outcome enough to rank its importance, to sort of rate its importance. Sorry, it's not a rank because that implies that there's like, you can only kind of put things as to like 1 or 2 or 3, but you can rank, you can rate many outcomes a 9 if you wish. So that's what round 1 looks like. And at this point, everything is completely sort of like anonymized. You don't know what other people had scored. And so you're allowed to just kind of rate things as you like. And so after round 1, I received all the data and I summarized it and put all those results back into round 2, which is the exact same survey, but it shows the results from round 1. And so let me sort of just break this down for you. So the same outcomes would be here on the left again, but what would happen is you can see each of these different rows of colors, right? So maybe, in purple for us might be what the results of the physicians' rates were. Orange here might be the results of the researchers' rates. And finally, this light color here would be maybe what the patients' rates of each outcome were. And so what this does is it allows for the individual to look at how other people scored the same outcomes, right? So you're kind of reflecting on what the group was thinking, but at the same time, you're still allowed to make your own decision as to what you think is important and why. And so in that way, it encourages people to sort of come to a consensus by reflecting, maybe saying, okay, like what this person said makes sense to me. I might rate a certain outcome a little higher now because of what this person has said, or not. That decision is still up to you. So I hope that kind of makes sense. So yeah, the criteria then that we applied to the final results were that for any outcome that had over 70% of participants rated 7 to 9 and fewer than 15% rating it 1 to 3, that would mean that we include that outcome in the core outcome set. And then exclusion is sort of the reverse. And we applied this criteria to the results of all the participants, so we weren't stratifying by the stakeholder type or not. So now what we've done is we finished the survey stage when we had many people tell us what they thought were most important. And then the next stage after that is usually what's called a consensus meeting. So at this point, a smaller group of experts then looks at the survey results, and then from there they make some decisions as to what they want to do with the final core outcome set. And so for us, we had 15 physician researchers from 8 different countries help us make these decisions. And so this was a meeting that was kind of born out of basically the attendees of the 10th International Symposium on Diabetes, Hypertension, Metabolic Syndrome, and Pregnancy in 2019. And it's important to note, so our consensus panel didn't actually touch the results that came out of the survey. So what that means is for any outcomes that already met inclusion criteria, we decided to leave those as was. We wouldn't say, okay, yeah, the survey said to include this, but we don't feel like it, so we'll just leave it out. No, we stuck with what the results were, but we did discuss indeterminate outcomes. So any outcomes that fell into sort of a gray zone were discussed amongst this panel and voted upon. And so the criteria for inclusion there would be over 70% of members voting in favor. They also discussed how to group the outcomes, and they also were allowed the opportunity to suggest additional outcomes and vote on those again with the same inclusion criteria. There's me like in the back, by the way, on the laptop. I just think that's kind of like a funny picture. Okay, and then, yeah, so the result of that would be this core outcome set. So let me take you through the results. So in terms of the participants in our survey, we had 134 registrants from 23 countries. Round 1 was initiated by 115 people. Round 2 was initiated by 67, and 56 completed both rounds in their entirety. Across all the stakeholder groups, most people were women of European ethnicity, and we did get a variety of healthcare professionals involved in our survey. Most of them were kind of concentrated in this field of interest, understandably, so obstetricians and gynecologists, dietitians, endocrinologists. In terms of patients, most patients actually ended up coming from Canada, which I'll kind of dive into a little bit later in the discussion, but we thought that was kind of interesting. So that's what the participant sort of population looked like. Okay, and then this was really interesting to me. So, you know, I mentioned that this Delphi survey is sort of meant to encourage consensus, right? So for me, like there was this question of, okay, well, how can I be sure that people's opinions did change to converge from round 1 to round 2? And so what I tried to do was like sort of quantify it. And let me give you an example by looking at one outcome specifically. So these are the results for weight, the outcome of weight. On the left is a histogram of the scores for round 1, and then on the right is a histogram of scores for round 2. And so you can kind of see that the scores tighten up a little bit, right? And so basically what I did was I took the standard deviation from one round to another. And so I looked at that across all of the outcomes. And so the mean change in standard deviation of all the outcomes from round 1 to round 2 was negative 0.24. So the standard deviation decreased with a 95% confidence interval of negative 0.27, negative 0.21. So pretty confident here that there was a degree of convergence that was facilitated by the Delphi process. Oops. All right. So in terms of the number of outcomes, I'll get to the outcomes themselves in a bit, but from the Delphi survey, 46 of them met that inclusion criteria that I stated earlier. 75 were indeterminate, so the consensus panel looked at those 75 and voted to include 8 of them. And then the consensus panel also suggested 7 potential other outcomes, and voting on those resulted in 3 being included. And so that comes to a total of 57 outcomes. And then we again went through this process of trying to reduce any redundancies for a total of 50 outcomes and 19 domains. And so now you're probably wondering, like, okay, can you give an example of what you mean by reducing those redundancies? I think within those 57 outcomes, there were several that related to diet. So there was fat intake, saturated fat intake, carbohydrate intake, and so forth. And so those were collapsed into an outcome called macronutrients. And so this was the final thing. This is the core outcome set that we came up with. And so I know it looks a little like big and kind of overwhelming, but I can break it down for you bit by bit. And so what I'd like you to pay attention to firstly is the timing we broke it down by timing of the intervention. And we also broke it down by domain or category. And so those are represented in sort of like the orange text. So I'll take you through timing first, because as I mentioned at the beginning, there are studies that are able to follow a woman up like 5, like 10 years, or not necessarily follow up, but you know, they enroll women who are many years past their pregnancy. And there are trials that also try to look at women much earlier on, immediately after their pregnancy. So some outcomes will apply or not, depending on when how the intervention is sort of timed. There are some that apply irrespective of intervention timing. So for example, some of those outcomes would be, maybe some of the more intuitive ones would be OGTT, so the results of your oral glucose tolerance test, your average blood glucose, HbA1c, There are also measures related directly to the program itself. So participation, so that's a measure of the people who you enrolled in your study, how many actually engaged with your intervention, with your trial. So things like this would be applicable irrespective of your intervention timing. But to give an example of things that are more time dependent, well, there are some that can be measured directly after delivery, right? So postpartum weight retention is one that can be measured pretty easily right afterwards. And breastfeeding is also pretty relevant immediately after delivery. There are some outcomes that will only apply to interventions that focus on like the screening for diabetes risk. So I know I use the terminology sort of like health behavior interventions. And so you probably think like, okay, like changes to diet, changes to physical activity, but there's also some trials that specifically just look at whether a woman is attending their postpartum diabetes screening test. So those outcomes would apply only to those kinds of interventions. There are some outcomes that you would be able to capture if you followed the woman up to a subsequent pregnancy, right? So if they have another bout of gestational diabetes, then that's another sign that they might be at higher risk of developing type 2 diabetes later on, as well as maternal hypertensive disease. And then if you're able to sort of follow up the woman to much later on, and you are able to capture a type 2 diabetes diagnosis, a type 1 diabetes diagnosis, then that's ideal. So I hope that kind of gives a sense of how you might sort of approach this core outcome set. So in total, we were able to engage 115 stakeholders in the survey and 15 consensus panel members in the development of this core outcome set. And the core outcome set has 50 outcomes, with outcomes that really span the breadth of GDM care. And so, as I mentioned before, actually, let me just go back. I kind of pointed to a select few, but I did want you to take note of just how diverse these outcomes are, right? So it's not only that we're measuring things related to the program, our typical sort of what we measure in the clinic, but also things like knowledge. So what does the woman know about diabetes and how to prevent it? Health literacy, social support. And so it goes beyond what you might typically just measure quickly in the clinic. Okay, and I guess just to kind of hit that point home again, so 50 outcomes, it might still seem like a lot, but even if you look at the top outcomes, let's say over 85% of participants or more scored these outcomes really highly, even if you look at these ones, the diversity of the outcomes within the whole set is still represented. So, looking at even here, fat intake and saturated fat intake, even if those don't cross your arbitrary like 85% and above threshold, we still have diet quality being represented here. Moderate to vigorous activity might not hit that arbitrary 85% and above sort of line, but sedentary time is there. So I think it just goes to show that people thought that a variety of outcomes were really important to include. And so this is really interesting to me. If you pay attention to any slide in my presentation, I would pay attention to this one because I thought it was really cool that you could see something in the numbers. But I mentioned that the Delphi process is supposed to help people come to a consensus, right? So this act of like reflecting on the round one data and then maybe changing your own opinion. But it was fascinating to see how this played out. So taking a look at the outcome of quality of life, for example. So the patients rated it pretty highly from the beginning, right? So 78% of the patients rated it as very important, but only 60% of healthcare professionals did. And so if you take the average of that, that would be 63.7, and it wouldn't cross the 70% threshold for inclusion. But in round two, that number shoots up from 60 to 73.5, right? And so that helps it cross the threshold for inclusion. And so we think that that's sort of where we start thinking about, okay, like, we want to be more patient-centered. And so that's where the healthcare professionals were kind of able to reflect on what someone else had thought and said, yeah, okay, actually, I do think that this warrants more attention. So for something like sleep quality, so interestingly, again, patients rated that pretty highly from the beginning, but and healthcare professionals, I think more of them did end up sort of increasing what they thought the rating of it was, but it was still a little bit low. And so in order for sleep quality to have been retained as an outcome in the core outcome set, we would have needed, we were kind of, I guess, glad that the researchers and the patients were still rating that highly. Not glad, but if basically saying that if the researchers and the patients weren't there, and if it was just left up to the healthcare professionals, then sleep quality might not be included. But we know that sleep has an effect on insulin resistance. And we're talking about risk of developing type 2 diabetes here, type 1 diabetes, so that's important to consider. Now, the reverse is kind of happened with body mass index and measures of weight. So from round 1 to round 2, the patients didn't seem to rank that very highly, whereas the healthcare professionals and the researchers did. So we think that that might be pointing to some kind of stigma or shame related to weight. And so if you consider that, many of these trials will be focusing on weight, that might be something important to consider when you're designing your program or your trial, is how to address like that stigma and the shame. At the same time that we were developing this core outcome set, there was another group who developed a similar core outcome set, but they focused on making their set very small. And basically, I think the main difference here was that in their consensus panel meeting, they allowed panel members to have a say in whether or not the survey results could be sort of changed to what the panel members thought was more or less important. So just to kind of bring your attention to this top table here, which it's just a screenshot from their paper. From the survey, it looks like outcomes such as physical activity were scored very highly, so 89% of people thought it was very important. Quality of life, 79% of people thought it was very important. But those didn't make it into their final core outcome set, which is here. Therefore, a final core outcome set focused a lot on sort of those like physical characteristics again, so the BMI, glycemic status. So in comparison, our core outcome set really touched on those other factors that might be important that, I guess in this survey, their survey participants also thought were important. And we wanted to stick to what our protocol said we would do, which is that whatever was included based on the survey results would be included. So we stayed true to that. So I guess overall, our survey was really strong in a sense that we actually provided it in 3 different languages. We got answers from 23 different countries. One of the issues is that most people who participated in the survey came from high income and upper middle income countries. So, when you think about the resources that are required to measure all of the outcomes that we mentioned, those might not be as applicable in low income or middle income countries. So this core outcome set is less applicable there. We had high attrition from registration to completion of the survey, especially of patients, and doing a little bit of digging into what's like best practice for core outcome set surveys, like Delphi surveys. Anything with more than 50 outcomes should expect like a higher attrition rate. So our survey was quite long, and so patients might have felt burdened by that. And interestingly, though, I think researchers had the highest sort of like rate of completing the survey, and I wonder if that's because we know a little bit more about the struggle of trying to recruit and retain people in studies. Patient input could have been improved, so just A, in terms of the numbers, but also B, most patients came from Canada, and I think that was a result of how we went about recruiting them. I guess most of the GDM studies that we sort of reached back into were Canadian. Despite that, though, the representation from women with GDM was really important in retaining some of those more patient-centered outcomes, as you saw earlier. Again, we stayed true to our published methods. We wanted to make sure that whatever was included in the survey would not be touched by the consensus panel. So yeah, it's a large core outcome set. I think that's one of the things that people might be kind of scared of when they look at it, but A, not all of them apply to every trial, right? Because we said that it can be broken up by timing of the intervention. And some outcomes are meant to enhance implementation of the intervention itself. So it's not that all of these outcomes are going to be something that are about the woman and her health outcomes, but it's important to include some of those program measures. So I mentioned participation earlier. there are health economic measures. And the reason for this is because, again, we don't want to just do an RCT and leave it at that, right? We want to be able to sort of assess the potential of it to be translated to a real program that can have an effect on these women's lives. So the next steps ideally would be to try to find a better way to engage women with GDM, maybe through a qualitative study to better discern their priorities. And then also, now that we have a list of outcomes that we think are most important to be measured in these trials, the next question is, how do you best measure those outcomes? And so that's a whole other sort of project that's guided by another kind of initiative. So overall, people are interested in how we can use health behavior change trials to prevent diabetes in women who are at known high risk. We went through a really methodologically rigorous process that ended up defining a core outcome set that included a range of outcomes, not only glycemia and cardiometabolic measures, but also things related to behavior and the woman's context, and also program measures and economic measures. The goal of core outcome sets is to mandate researchers who are interested in doing trials in specific fields to use and uptake the outcomes that we have come up with. And so the idea is that by doing so, the results that we come up with won't go to waste. We don't want our research to go to waste. We want to be able to see and compare trial to trial so that we can make better decisions for patients in the future. I'm happy to take any questions now. Unfortunately, I haven't been looking at the chat, but I can sort of stop sharing and take a look at that. But yeah, there's my email as well if anybody wants to ask me any questions.
Thanks, Nancy. That was a really nice presentation, really nice thesis. Maybe I will start with a question if I don't see any hands up yet. So I've been thinking increasingly about this space about outcomes and what are the outcomes we should target and what outcomes matter. And so I think I fully believe that putting the patients at the center of or involving them in that discussion is critical, because it's always surprising to see or hear what they prioritize and what we think they would want to prioritize. So I'm curious, let's see, where do I start? How do you, so let's say you've established the domains, or I'm going to call them that. Yeah. Is there standardized ways of quantifying these outcomes, and do we know what the minimally clinically important difference is? Because often that's needed to design a trial, or it's very informative to design a trial if you can say, if you can estimate or state what you think a meaningful increment would be in, say, whatever outcome. I mean, for some of the more research-oriented outcomes like HbA1c and much more quantitative BMI, I suppose some of those deltas might be known from other literature. I don't know, diabetes is not my forte, but for some of the perhaps patient identified outcomes like quality of life, there's questionnaires, often it's domains or disease specific. So do you know of anything in this space?
Right. Yeah, so I think what you're kind of like touching on is like, yeah, there are some factors that we're really comfortable talking about and using as a measure of whether or not they'll have a real impact. And so yeah, HbA1c being one of them. But then in terms of some of the other ones that are just now maybe starting to like come out, such as like quality of life, maybe for another disease, that another outcome might be like pain. Like, how do we assess that? And I think even a question that I have for myself is like, how do we, as like healthcare or like future healthcare professionals or healthcare professionals, like how do we view that, and like does that make a real impact on the decisions we make in terms of like what programs to translate? And yeah, I mean, to be completely honest, I'm not too familiar with the different tools that have been used for like quality of life, say. And I think that that's where that whole initiative that I just mentioned at the end there about like what are the best ways to measure, these sorts of outcomes are. So yeah, I'm not too familiar with those, but I think that that might be up to like the researchers themselves is to look at the outcome and say like, okay, the patients have told us that, whatever tool we used to measure it, the patients have told us that, they like the amount of pain they experience is really important to them. And, this trial shows that like this, we managed to achieve like a reduction in pain, or we didn't manage to achieve that. And then I think it's kind of up to like us to actually see that and act on it. I think the reason I say that is because even with the other core outcome set that was being developed, right, that I mentioned, the quality of life measure was rated very highly, but the consensus panel for some reason didn't decide to include that in the final core outcome set. I don't know why, but I wonder if in terms of like actually using the results that we see, using what patients have told us, like that might be up to like us to kind of stay true to that. Whether or not we know if it's clinically like important, I don't know. I also say this as someone who like has spoken to a lot of people with chronic conditions, and certainly a lot of patients. Some of them feel listened to, and some of them don't. So yeah, I think a lot about it too.
It's definitely a science unto itself, developing these scales and validating them and identifying these differences. I suspect that the application of these types of measures, it's very disease specific. Like you mentioned, pain is probably a very good example. I work with lung diseases, and so breathlessness is a very good example. But in the space that you're working in, it might be that, that the horizon for outcomes, like you mentioned in your introduction, can be very, very long. And so similar to hypertension, the notion of quality of life as a scale in hypertension, the goal really is to prevent these bad outcomes in the distant future. So putting quality of life front and center, it might be important for, say, side effects of drugs, but diabetes prevention, it may not be a tractable outcome.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. Yeah. Yeah. I think that maybe where it might fit into these trials is, say, like depending on the nature of the intervention itself, if you're asking women to try to find a way to exercise X times a day for this amount of time while also caring for a newborn, I think maybe that's where it comes in a little bit.
Yeah. That's great.
Yeah.
And so it should be sent. So my next question, I don't see any other hands, is there's talk often, I'm not a trialist by day, so I don't, but I listen to a lot of podcasts and things related to this, is this notion of composite endpoints versus, single standalone primary endpoints. So you've mentioned many outcomes that are of interest to the stakeholders, including patients, which is great. Do you envisage trial or intervention studies where it's like some composite score, or should people be choosing a single lead outcome as their primary and then a bunch of others as secondary or exploratory?
Oh, interesting. That's a big question for you to ask
But I guess
your medical student.
I'll give you a hint, or where I think some of the controversy is, a trial might have some composite outcome that includes everything from, say, death to some sort of other not so good outcome, but nowhere close to as bad as death. And they're all kind of weighted equally, and the trial might turn out to be positive, meaning that some intervention is shown to improve the composite outcome. But you might want to dissect, well, were we impacting death, or were we impacting this minor procedural thing? And so there's some people scrutinize, or people should scrutinize composite outcomes. I'm not saying that they shouldn't be used. There's often biological rationale behind it, but here you have this composite, or well, you have these many different outcomes that span different domains, I think, with like including what we understand about the biology of diabetes and, like, for example, the A1C and the glucose levels, to these much more subjective sort of, but very important patient-centered kind of quality of life type outcomes. So have you thought about how a trial that was going to, if you were going to embark on a trial to address this, how would you frame your primary outcome?
Right. Wow. Thanks for bringing that up. I didn't realize that that was sort of like a subject of contention right now. But you know what you said reminds me of how I learned epidemiology from McGill, which is that, you know, even for like something like basic statistics, right? You should never just look at like a p-value and say, okay, well, it crosses this threshold or that it doesn't. You go back to the data, you see like what's the context that you're working with, what were the different measures that you were looking at, and the conclusion that you come to isn't just based on like this single number, right? You really have to kind of dissect it and consider everything. And so, yeah, I mean, I think I probably learned more about what you just asked me than what I can offer you. But yeah, I think it is important. I probably am biased towards what you just said as well, that you should consider everything.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. You're getting some thanks and shout outs on the chat.
Oh.
Okay, well, in that case, I think we can stop and enjoy the nice weather, at least here in Montreal.
Yes.
Thanks so much for sharing your work. It's really great.